Well, the mother of English devotional poetry, that's what I think we can legitimately call Mary Sidney Herbert. Mary Herbert is, unfortunately, one of the canon's best kept secrets, a lyrical genius, really, to whom many other poets, including John Donne, George Herbert, Thomas Traherne, all owe a huge debt of gratitude. I want to open with reading her Psalm 117. It's the shortest psalm. It's the shortest of the Hebrew Psalms. The book of Psalms is an anthology of 150 poems attributed to King David and others. It's used in Hebrew worship and also Christian worship. It includes songs of praise, laments, communal and personal uh, celebrations and tragedy, expressions of anger, gratitude, hope. They're really everything in the Bible you can find in the Psalms. It's what the old reformers used to say. John Donne, he preached a sermon in which he said that the Psalms were the manna of the church. Just, quote, as manna tasted to every man like what he liked best, so do the Psalms minister instruction and satisfaction to every man in every emergency and occasion. This idea that the Psalms could appeal to anyone's taste. Here's a fun psalm here. This one's included in Christopher Rix's Oxford Book of English Verse. Praise him that aye remains the same. All tongues display Jehovah's fame. Sing all that share this earthly ball. His mercies are exposed to all. Like as the word once he doth give, rolled in record, doth time outlive. Remember from our lecture on the Renaissance poetry, how poetry became a visual art as much as it was an audible art. Print culture made it this way. And here we have a very visual object of a poem, where we have the what's called an acrostic, the first words here spelling out praise the Lord, and the reading experience as one normally would read from left to right across the page. A few things here. There really wasn't a J at this time in early modern letters. They just used the I. And spelling was not standardized at this time. So you might say, well, she's missing the E here, but praise was spelled this way. It was one way you could spell praise. So this little poem is a great example of the characteristics of experimentation, lyrical experimentation of this period. There's a visual playfulness that enables others, the readers and also future poets, to follow in this sort of levity. These sort of poems were criticized as cutesy by the 18th century critics, mainly Joseph Addison and others who followed suit, as being false wit. However, uh, we're witnessing the beginning of lyric poetry. And this kind of poem, this kind of poem as an acrostic, has pedigree in the Hebrew mode. The Hebrew Psalms themselves used modes of reading like this, acrostics and such. Psalm 119 is organized according to the Hebrew alphabet, for example. So this playfulness is a part of the architecture of the Hebrew Psalms themselves, and it's something that Lady Mary Sidney Herbert, I think, foregrounds beautifully. This little poem exemplifies beautifully the two qualities that I'd like to discuss in this lecture. I'd like to discuss two aspects. The first is I want to give you a sure sense of her lyrical mastery and ingenuity. She's an incredibly careful poet. And the second thing is I want to give you a sense of her lyrical levity, or perhaps a better word would be her playfulness. Something I think that will live on in some of the devotional poets we'll be reading in our course. So welcome all to our first meeting in the course on English devotional poets. As we begin this mini course through the month of May, I'm joined over Zoom by my Patreon supporters who are supporting this work. So thanks to them for their support and helping me make the study of poetry accessible to readers outside the university. We're going to meet after the lecture to discuss some of our favorite and more interesting poems from our readings. So if you'd like to support my work, and join the Patreon community. You can find more about that in the description below. We begin with Mary Sidney Herbert's translations of the Psalms. And unlike my foundational lectures through the history of English poetry, this one aims at not only introducing new readers to Mary Herbert's translations, but also to explore an aspect of her poetry that isn't often discussed. And in that sense, this lecture has a more academic side in that it hopes to provide something new. Scholarly interest in Mary Sidney Herbert's poetry has grown over the past 2, 3 decades, with renewed appreciation for her art, and rightly so, I think. And something that doesn't often get discussed, uh, very often, it has been talked about, but not much, is perhaps what I find the most delightful thing about her poetry, this sense of playfulness. So, but first, who was Lady Mary Sidney Herbert? She was sister to Sir Philip Sidney. She was born in 1561 and lived until 1621. She married Henry Herbert, 2nd Earl of Pembroke, in 1577. She was 15 at the time. That was not unusual. Mary Herbert provided a center for the Sidney Circle in her home at Wilton House, and this was really the center of English Renaissance literary activity during the Elizabethan age. It was at Wilton House where Sir Philip Sidney wrote Arcadia for her, and there she gathered around her distinguished group of poets, friends, intellectuals, artists, and Calvinistically inclined theologians. Mary Herbert was obviously a prominent figure in the literary life of Elizabethan England. Although she's known today for her role as a patron of the arts, she also made some significant literary contributions of her own. Her most enduring, I think, was the translation of the Psalms. It was a work begun by her brother Sir Philip Sidney and was left unfinished following his early death. He completed the first 43 Psalms, but Mary Sidney undertook to finish the collection by translating the 44 to 150. So most of the Psalms were translated by her. Not only were her translations superior to her brother's, at least in a certain lyrical dimension, they introduced a new mode of devotional expression and showed how much the lyric poem could enact the devotional experiences within language itself. This is something that we see other translators not really doing. So since we'll end on a light note with the levity, we'll begin with a darker strain. Let's turn to her translation of Psalm 51. This was an important psalm for the English Reformation. It's one of the penitential psalms, and that means that it deals with confession and forgiveness of sin and repentance. I'm going to read you these two beginning stanzas. O Lord, whose grace no limits comprehend, sweet Lord, whose mercies stand from measure free, to me that grace, to me that mercy send, and wipe, O Lord, my sins from sinful me. O cleanse, O wash my foul iniquity. Cleanse still my spots, still wash away my stainings, till stains and spots in me leave no remainings. Just going to stop here at this beginning stanza and say that her command of both meter and sound is evident from the start. In contrast to the God addressed, who has no limits, and whose mercy is free from measure, the voice of the poem finds its song in both limitation and measure. She's using both here, as conspicuously this poem ends with a limit, an end stop. And so does this, carried forward by meter and alliteration. The form itself we've seen before. So those of you who have been following my lectures on the traditions of English poetry may recognize this stanzaic form from our lectures on Middle English and Renaissance poetry. This is Chaucer's rhyme royale, used in his Troilus and Cressade. He invented this form, and Sir Thomas Wyatt, we saw, repurposed it. but you almost wouldn't recognize it by its tabulation. Rhyme Royale has the rhyme scheme B, B, C, C. Two couplets there at the end, give it a sense of finality. But we've got the tabulation here, shaping it as it goes. We're moving further as the couplets are completed. We notice too that her final couplet, the CC rhyme, is a feminine rhyme. And I think that this is she's very self-consciously a woman poet. And she wants to embody that in her poetry. And we see this in some of the other translations of the Psalms. Her Psalm 125 is written in Sapphic stanzas. So she's writing after the mode of Sappho, the great Greek poetess, lyricist. So I think there's something going on here, but there's another reason why she would want to use rhyme royale for this poem in particular. I think it has to do with the Psalm's association with King David. This poem, the heading in the Septuagint, connects it to King David's psalm, who believed to have been written after his remorse for the sin with Bathsheba, having slept with Bathsheba and killed her husband Uriah. He's convicted by the prophet Nathan, and he writes this psalm. So the story goes. So there is this formal awareness, I think, that Herbert is bringing to this poem, connecting the rhyme royale with the royal king David. A very serious psalm, no doubt. And yet there is something spirited and, I don't know, endearing about her diction, her word choice, with an almost innocent use of the gerunds, stainings, and remainings. There's something disarming about this noun, remainings, um, with this feminine rhyme. Notice her use of polyptoton, one of her favorite figures, or schemes rather. This is a figure of speech that involves the repetition of words derived from the same root. So we have sins and sinful, and we have stains and stainings. These are words all derived from the same root. She'll also use chiasmus, interestingly, which I think she does here at the end. But she's also faithful to Hebrew form. Now, rhyme royale, particularly English form, invented by the father of English poetry, as Dryden calls him, Chaucer. But she also retains the Hebrew formalism here. Hebrew poetry is not organized by sound rhymes, but by thought rhymes, what you might call thought rhymes, often called parallelisms. The rephrasing of a sentiment in different words. So we have a wipe, or and wipe my sins from sinful me, oh cleanse, which is a synonym performing the same function, then wash my foul iniquity, which is really a parallelism here of this previous statement, which is then brought on and repeated again in cleanse still my spots. So this is an example. It's not a form of tautology. It's how Hebrew psalms were structured. And just let's move on to the second stanza before we move on from this psalm. For I, alas, acknowledging do know, here's the polyptoton again, my filthy fault, my faulty filthiness, to my soul's eye incessantly doth show, which done to thee I do confess, just judge, true witness, that for righteousness thy doom may pass, against my guilt awarded. Thy evidence for truth may be regarded. These rhymes, very intricate throughout the stanza, ness going through internally and also at the end. We have this filthy fault, my faulty filthiness, which pretty characteristic of penitential psalms. But also we have polyptoton, but the chiasmus structure, just A, B, B, A, where you have the reversal here. There's that exchange. Now, we don't have time to read the whole poem, but there's something important here I'd like to draw your attention to in the sixth stanza. I mentioned how this psalm was particularly important to the English Reformation, partly because it typifies this scriptural example of a confession to God unmediated by a priestly confessor, but it also gives a type for the progression of individual conversion. But there's another interesting thing about this poem, important to the history of women's English literature, a special allusion, you might call it. People talk about Taylor Swift hiding Easter eggs in her songs that point back to other songs from previous albums. Well, Lady Mary Herbert places an Easter egg here in the sixth stanza that points back not to one of her poems, but a different English Reformation hero, a woman poet named Anne Locke. And we go down to the sixth stanza here. Um, we find here. So I to them a guiding hand will be, whose faulty feet have wandered from thy way, and turned from sin will make return to thee, whom turned from thee sin erst had led astray. Just the playful intricacy here. O God, God of my health, oh, do away my bloody crime. Stop there, because this appellation of God doesn't come from Hebrew. It comes from Anne Locke, who was the first woman to publish a sonnet sequence in English. O God of my health. Psalm 51 of her sequence there. So this, for one thing, it shows many things about Mary Sidney Herbert. The first is that she's incredibly well read, but she's incredibly conscious of what she's doing and calling back in a way that will signal to her friends and her readers, who perhaps undoubtedly knew of this sonnet sequence, that she has this awareness and this indebtedness. So just a little fun something here in this poem. Now I want to turn to another example of Herbert's lyrical ingenuity before we move on to levity, and that's from Psalm 55, which is a beautiful translation. It's often anthologized. It's one of the most, I think, available poems of hers online. Usually when you search for Mary Sidney Herbert, this poem comes up, and it's for good reason, too. I want to highlight the visual and sonic intricacy of this poem, just to give you a sense of how great a poet she is. And we'll just listen. We'll do the same thing. We'll just read the first two stanzas here. And you notice the shapes of these lines. My God, most glad to look, most prone to hear, an open ear. Oh, let my prayer find, and from my plaint turn not thy face away. Behold my gestures, hearken what I say, while uttering moans with most tormented mind. My body I no less torment and tear, for lo, their fearful threatenings would mine ear, who griefs on me still heaping lay, a mark to wrath and hate and wrong assigned. Therefore my heart hath all his force resigned to trembling pants. Death terrors on me prey. I fear, nay, shake, nay, quivering quake with fear. So many fascinating things going on. This is a poem that's very aware of its visual and audible presence, asking the God to look and to hear. Song itself is making a sound and a visual object upon the page. It wants to be heard and seen. An open ear, oh, let my prayer find. And from my plaint, this means complaint, or in a legal sense, a complaint. Turn not thy face away. Now, poems, especially during this period, are very interested in the face, its ocular presence. It wants him to behold my gestures. What a strange way to put that. Gestures being very bodily, but also the poem itself is making these bodily gestures. So do you see how the devotional experience with which the language is concerned is being enacted in the language itself. And this is one of the unique qualities of lyric poetry. I'm muttering moans with most tormented mind. As your open ear is listening to this poem, you hear that long O. And when you think of a cry of pain, universally across all cultures, it usually is expressed through O or ow, this long vowel sound, which we have in moan. But it isn't just here. We've had it throughout this entire stanza. Most glad to look, most prone, that long O here. Open ear, oh, let my prayer find. And it goes on, carried through with most tormented mind in the alliteration of the M. My body, no. Torment and tear. This may seem grotesque, but this was an ancient form of lament. Um, Tearing the garments or the flesh. For lo, their fearful threatenings. This poem, you read it aloud and it cries out. It's wanting to be heard. I think this is something that she does so beautifully in many of her poems. And you notice the state of experience here, that the conscious state is that of terror, but it's also one connected to the lyre in lyric poetry. The strings of the lyre must tremble in order to make sound. And so, as the poem itself becomes the lyre, especially during the Renaissance, when poetry moves from orality into what Walter Ong calls secondary orality or this literary orality, uh, it becomes the lyre. So, instrument becomes the human voice, or what's here on the page. I fear, shake, no, quivering, quake. Again, that motion of the strings that are provoked into sound. Key to this lyric mode. And she's thinking aloud too. Notice how she's correcting herself. It's the utterance being spoken as it's being thought. And there's this spontaneity that's given here. Oh, it's something that we'll see in Donne, something that's in Herbert, where thought is developed in the lyric. The lyric is the unfolding of thought. And we see this, oh, come finally here from pain to wistfulness of longing. Then say I, oh, might I but cut the wind, borne on the wing the fearful dove doth bear. Stay would I not, till I in rest might stay. Oh, she's such an artist of the schematics, as Shakespeare is in his sonnets. Stay would I not, a panalepsis, this is called, where the line begins with the same word. But we also have chiasmus with this again. Stay as A, I as B, and then the mirror image there. But it's giving this sense of being encircled, of nestling, which is what she, as the dove, wants to do, to go far hence. Oh, far, then would I make my way unto the desert and repose me there. These storms of woe, these tempests left behind. And then it moves into the imprecatory mode here, but swallow them, the evildoers. She goes on beautifully here with this metaphor, with the personification, introducing perhaps a mask-like drama or allegory within the lines, but it's something worth exploring. But I think those first two stanzas will give you a good example of what to look for when you're reading, how to be sensitive to her poetry. The entire poem, it goes on for many stanzas, is made up of three end rhymes. Only three repeated sounds at the end of the lines, which is a huge feat of lyrical gymnastics in English, which as a language contains so few rhyming words. And yet, there's no syntactical contortions that we might expect from such a performance. The lines move with this unruffled civility and this unobtrusive grace, which we hardly notice. We hardly notice the dexterity necessary to complete this poem. I mean, it's really kind of a miracle. So, amazing lyricist, a lyrical genius, something not to be forgotten, and something to keep in mind as you're reading these poems on your own. She really mobilized the lyric as a mode of expression that enacted the devotional experience, didn't just talk about it. The language enters into the moment there, makes it present. A little digression before we move on to the levity is something something I should have probably said at the beginning, and that's that translations, these translations were not published until the 19th century, in 1823. In fact, David was just showing us his first edition of that here. Beautiful, small copy of the first printing of these poems. Elizabethans knew about these poems. Many of the printers were envious to be allowed to print them, but she did not give them the permission to do that. We don't know why. I think perhaps so she can gain control over the poems and retain her control on them, which is understandable. Um, but the Elizabethan poets regarded translation as an exciting form of poetry. And this is important for us because I think for contemporary readers, we're apt to think of translations as perhaps a lesser form of poetry because their content isn't personally original. We might think that the poet's feelings weren't really involved, but anyone who could read English during Lady Mary Sidney Herbert's period would have been able to read Latin. They might have even been able to read Greek and French and Italian as well. What this means is that translation for us usually is a means of access. I can't read Italian. I'm going to have to read a translation of Boccaccio. But for the Elizabethans who could read Latin, if they could read English, this wasn't for access. They read these poems for their artistry, to see what could be done through English. They wanted to make something new, faithfully new, and in their own language. So Mary Herbert is by no means a lesser poet simply because her greatest work is translation, or at least what's often regarded as her greatest lyrical work. Now, having gotten a firm sense of her artistry as a serious lyricist, I'd like to dwell on the playfulness of her translations. I'm going to turn to Psalm 139. She has that delightful phrase, lightful, flightful wings. I just kind of fell in love with this psalm when I came across those lines. Psalm 139 is a meditation of upon God's omniscience, his omnipotence, but it also uses a diction that is specifically near to the experiences of women. And the wonderful introduction goes into that of this 2009 book, The Sidney Psalter, which you can find in paperback. And we've been using that for our textbook in the course. But before we begin with Sidney's version, or Herbert's version, I want to give you a sense of what popular psalmody was like during her time. Here is Sternhold and Hopkins' translation of Psalm 139, written in common measure. It means you could sing this to Amazing Grace and many other poems, House of the Rising Sun, which I'll not do, but let me just give you an example. This is from the official psalm book of England at the time, authorized by Queen Elizabeth herself. O Lord, thou hast me tried and known, my sitting down dost know. My rising up in thoughts far off, thou understandst also. My path, yea, in my bed likewise, thou art about always, and by familiar custom art acquainted with my ways. No word is in my tongue, O Lord, that is not known to thee. Thou hast beset me round about, and laid thy hand on me. Such knowledge is too wonderful, and past my skill to gain. It is so high, that I unto the same cannot attain. So there's a very apparent earnestness to this translation, which can be felt in its plain and deliberately uninteresting diction. This is one of the few instances of a metaphor or anthropomorphization that sometimes the Sternhold and Hopkins translators will allow. In one version of Psalm 23, where it says, "The Lord is my shepherd," they completely omitted that metaphor. And it was, "The Lord, he doth me feed." Totally omitted the metaphor of the shepherd. So there's this suspicion in the English Reformed style against an adorned style. So they want an unadorned style. They don't want the words to draw attention to themselves. The Sternhold and Hopkins was popular and much loved. It was accessible and fun to read. You could put it to your favorite ballad tune, or murder ballad, or a bawdy ballad, and you could sing the Psalms this way. If the Sternhold and Hopkins Psalter was the psalmody for the masses, and it was, the Sidney Psalter was the psalmody for the aristocracy, the court, the refined, the artistic. They had different aims, these Psalters, different aesthetic aims completely. So we should judge them accordingly. But the Sidney Psalter wanted to show what a delicate and artful style could achieve with the Psalms in English. We're going to turn to her lines. We're just going to read through this poem. The stanzas, the rhyme scheme is A, B, C, C, B, A, B. It's interesting. She has this couplet here in the most extreme case of metrical contraction of Demeter here. But when I sit, thou markest it. And it has that turn there. So sometimes these stanzas will enclose the content. O Lord, in me there lieth naught, but to thy search revealed eyes. Excuse me, let me let in Amy here. O Lord, in me there lieth naught, but to thy search revealed lies. For when I sit, thou markest it. No less thou notice when I rise. Yea, closest closet of my thought hath open windows to thine eyes. And the editors of the Oxford edition note that the closest closet is probably a part of the domestic diction that would have been very near at home for an Elizabethan or a Renaissance woman, such as Lady Mary Herbert, this closest closet. And of course, it does harken back to the synoptic gospel injunction that to go into your closet to pray, to the deepest, deepest thought, the inner chamber. Thou walkest with me when I walk. When to my bed for rest I go, I find thee there and everywhere. Not youngest thought in me doth grow. No, not one word I canst to talk, but yet unuttered thou dost know. If forth I march, thou goest before me, or thou goest before. If back I turn, thou comest behind. So forth nor back thy guard I lack. Nay, on me too thy hand I find. Well I thy wisdom may adore, but never reach with earthly mind. Very different articulation from the Sternhold and Hopkins version of that. No word is in my tongue, O Lord, that is not known to thee. Thou hast beset me round about and laid thy hand on me. Very, very different, stylistically. To shun thy notice, leave thine eye. Oh, whither might I take my way? To starry sphere, thy throne is there. To dead men's undelightsome stay, there is thy walk, and there to lie unknown. In vain I should essay. The Geneva Bible, which we don't have the King James Bible yet when she's writing this. So the main version is the Geneva Bible, probably the one she favored over the Bishop's Bible. About this part, the Geneva Bible says, "Let me take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea." And it's very close to the King James Version. Very beautiful. Nothing at all wrong with that translation. But here's how she will do it. She does it her own way. O sun, whom light nor flight can match, suppose thy lightful, flightful wings thou lend to me, and I could flee as far as thee the evening brings. Even led to west he would me catch, nor should I lurk with western things. Elliptiton again. And the intricacies of these lines with the sounds. I in light and flight, the polyptoton, so playful here, so clearly playful, in lightful and flightful wings. Oh, so something that you can't come away from this if you've read Herbert without thinking Herbert certainly read Lady Mary Sidney Herbert. I was reading again this edition with the notes at the back of the book. They suggest that Western things, I would have never thought this. They suggest that the Western things is a reference to the New World. The Pembrokes and the Sidneys all helped finance expeditions to the New World. They were very interested in the New World, these Western things. So instead of saying dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, they're actually thinking beyond the sea, perhaps. That's so interesting. She's bringing in contemporary Elizabethan, sometimes even political notions and experience. Okay, do thou thy best, O secret night, in sable veil to cover me. Thy sable veil shall vainly fail. With day unmasked my night shall be, for night is day, and darkness light, O Father of all lights, to thee. Again, she's addressing the night, the apostrophizing of both the sun, the night, all innovations, very Elizabethan as well. And in each inmost piece is me is thine, while yet I and my mother dwelt. All that me clad from thee I had. Thou in my, excuse me, thou in my frame hast strangely dealt. Needs in my praise thy works must shine, so inly them my thoughts have felt. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Describing through metaphor, she doesn't shy away from metaphor here. And she says, Thou, how my back was beam-wise laid, and raftering of my ribs, dost know, knowst every point of bone and joint, how to this whole these parts did grow, in brave embroidery, fair arrayed, though wrought in shod, both dark and low. Thinking of the old English kenning for the body, which was bone house or bonhus. The idea of the body being constructed in this carpentry metaphor, which gives way, or rather an architectural metaphor, which gives way to embroidery. The finishing touches is that of embroidery, which is a lady's art. So this is interesting that we see God being imagined to create the body, fashioning the body as a carpenter, as an architect, but also as a lady through embroidery. This is another way that she encodes the female experience into these psalms. And I'm going to finish with these final stanzas. Nay, fashionless, ere form I took, thy all and more beholding eye, my shapeless shape could not escape. All these time frames successively, ere one had been, in the book of thy foresight enrolled did lie. Enrolling did lie. Again, the change of the metaphor to book of life, very Hebrew, has precedence in the Old Testament. My God, how I these studies prize, that do thy hidden workings show, whose sum is such, no sum so much, nay, some descend, they sumless grow. This, again, the polyptoton, the inner rhymes, the assonance going on here. It's almost dizzying. You have to step back and read it again. What's she saying? I lie to sleep, from sleep I rise, yet still in thought with thee I go. My God, if thou but one wouldst kill, then straight would leave my further chase this cursed brood, inured to blood, whose graceless taunts at thy disgrace have aimed oft, and hating still would with proud lies thy truth outface. Hate not I them who hate, who thee do hate? Again, imprecatory here, or verging on it. Thine, Lord, I will the censure be. Detest I not the cankered not, whom I against thee banded see? O Lord, thou know'st, in highest rate, I hate them all as foes to me. Then ending with this address to God, we've had all kinds of apostrophe, and now the petition. Search me, my God, and prove my heart. Examine me, and try my thought, another parallelism, and mark in me if aught there be that hath which cause their anger wrought. If not, as not, my life's each part, Lord, safely guide from danger brought. I I think this is just such a great example. It's so clearly and it's so obviously an exercise in great fun. She's clearly in high spirits, and there's no sign of drudgery or tired doggedness that we get in these lyrics, as we sometimes get with Sternhold and Hopkins, I think, I'm afraid. Um, but the voice of these poems is often disarmingly genuine in their levity, and the voice doesn't take itself too seriously. And what would almost call the energy of these translations, sometimes verging on a kind of childlikeness, not to be confused with childishness, but rather this innocent expression of voice addressed to a being that is both terrible and at times adorable. Her use of a bold, playful voice in these psalms, I think, influenced the honest searchings of George Herbert's most intimate poems. And I think some of the Wesley brothers as well in their hymns. Not sure if they had access to these translations. They may have, but they certainly had access to George Herbert, and I think we see that living on for centuries. Certainly, the lyrical ingenuity and experimentation is to be seen in George Herbert, but the tones of levity and play are there as well. I think that's really a gift that she gave English devotional poetry. So, to conclude, um, Mary Herbert's translations of the Psalms were widely praised for beauty, for their accuracy, and actually did a lot to establish the English language as a suitable medium for religious expression. This really freed up the creativity of poets who would come after, who were so, I mean, the English mind at this time. The trouble is, how do you represent states of religiosity, addresses to a divine being, and how do you do it appropriately? This was a problem of style, and I think she paved the way in saying this is how it can be done for some of the greatest devotional poets. Her contributions to literature and culture were significant, especially at a time right after the Spanish Armada was defeated by the English, and there was this new rise of English pride, national identity. She, when she returned to London shortly after that period, she really saw herself as a patron of the English arts, and she contributed to this cause, helped support the development of English poetry and literature during this important era. And her own writing was influential in its own right, not only as an influence to, other poets, but in their own right. It showed what beauty could be made of the Psalms in English. So, following the Elizabethan craze for Petrarchan love songs and sonnets, it tapped into this new form of expression that really legitimized devotional experience as a subject as intense, I think, as romantic passion that the Petrarchan mood gave us. And it proved that the Psalms could be translated with both beauty, delicacy, appropriateness, and accuracy. So I hope this gave you a little temptation to explore the sonnets, or the Psalms, rather, on your own. For everyone watching on YouTube, thanks for watching, and we'll see you all in the next video.